Overcoming Anxiety and Depression, a Mindful Approach is a presentation that I've been doing at local libraries, and I wanted to make it available to listeners of my podcast, Mindful Recovery. And you'll be able to find it on the YouTube channel there, and I'm going to post it in the Mindful Recovery Facebook group, so please go look for that and join. That's another place that I answer questions. And like I said, if you have questions at the end of this presentation, it's going to be about 45 minutes to an hour. Please go ahead and just make notes. Feel free to make notes as you go through. And then send me those questions by email, my contacts at the end of the slideshow, and I'll get back to you with those answers as soon as I possibly can. In the meantime, you might want to pick up some of those episodes of Mindful Recovery Podcast. You can find those at mindfulrecoverypodcast.com, or you can find the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play and iHeartRadio and just about anywhere that you can get podcasts, pretty much. All right, so sit back and enjoy the slideshow. So let's start with the definition of what is anxiety. Anxiety can take two forms. It can be generalized or specific. It can result from trauma or just generalized stress over a period of time. And it can result in panic attacks. So what I mean by generalized is this kind of just low-level feeling that everything's not okay, this anxiousness that we go through from day to day that doesn't rise to the level of a panic attack or even close to that, but it's just kind of there. And so I'm already like stressed out, and then when the smallest thing happens, it seems like I pop off, right? So that's that kind of generalized anxiety that's underneath everything. I'm always anxious and I'm not sure why. Specific anxiety may be like phobias, OCD, other outward expressions that are rooted in anxiety, or it may feel like panic attacks, like really intense panic where I feel like I'm having a heart attack and I can't breathe anymore. The thing about anxiety is that it's nearly always rooted in fear. Okay? It's fear of what might be in the future most often, or fear of what has been in the past coming back again. Now, obviously, if there's a tiger behind me, the fear is very well placed, and anxiety is something that's very helpful for me to begin feeling because it's going to create the body reactions I need, the increased heart rate, the increased rapid shallow breathing, the muscle tension. It's going to get me ready for fight or flight. But if I'm in the middle of Walmart and I'm remembering a tornado that happened in Joplin several years ago, something has triggered that memory, then it's not so helpful to have that anxiety and that almost panic attack going on in that space, okay? So now let's talk about the symptoms of depression. And here's what I want you to understand. And we're going to talk about this a little later too, but stress over time can create anxiety. Anxiety over time can create depression. These three things are very interrelated, and we're going to get into the hows and whys of that in a few minutes. But the symptoms of depression now can look like difficulty of concentration or making decisions, so our head isn't quite as clear. This can also be a symptom of stress and anxiety. Fatigue and decreased energy. It takes a lot of energy to fight that kind of anxiety over a long period of time, and depression starts to result from that fatigue. Feelings of guilt, worthlessness, and or helplessness. Feelings of hopelessness and or pessimism. So our outlook becomes very negative. We stop seeing hope in our future. Insomnia, early morning wakefulness, or excessive sleeping. So we're really looking at changes in sleeping patterns that are significant. Irritability or restlessness can be a result. A loss of interest in activities, loss or interest in activities or hobbies once pleasurable. So used to enjoy playing tennis and be really fanatical about every day out on the court playing tennis for an hour or two, and now you can't even do it on the weekends when you have time. Change in appetite, maybe an increase in appetite, maybe a decrease in appetite. Persistent aches or pains. We know that depression can actually, we begin to focus more on the aches and pains in our body, so we notice those more. Persistent sad, anxious, or empty feelings like there's no hope. Thoughts of attempts of suicide. So these are all symptoms of depression that can occur. So I want to talk a little about the emotional brain now and how that works in us. Now that we know what the signs and symptoms of anxiety and depression are, let's talk about how it gets that way. The limbic region is the lower portion of the brain, so it's your cerebellum and the brain stem and all that stuff down there. The thalamus is that big thing in the center that looks kind of like a brown kidney in this image. And it scans the environment for sensory data. So basically, it's looking all over your environment for what you hear, smell, feel, taste. All those senses are it's gathering the data from those, and it sends it two places. It sends it to the amygdala, which is just below it, that walnut brown shaped thing there, and to the frontal region of your brain. And the frontal region of your brain is there to make sense of all that data, because the data isn't really defined. It's just a packet of information that gets sent. So the frontal region of your brain is supposed to make sense of that, right? But here's what happens. If some of this information signals to the amygdala danger. So for instance, in the case of PTSD, someone who survived the tornado in Joplin a few years back, and maybe they were laying in a ditch in the water and they could smell mold and wet, and all of a sudden they're out in public and they feel it's raining and it smells moldy, and they're suddenly triggered and having this memory of the tornado again. That's because the amygdala put that sensory input of the smell of mold and wet together, and it sensed danger, right? The last time this happened, I was in a tornado and there was danger. And when the amygdala senses danger, it begins to secrete cortisol and adrenaline, which are two drugs that hype us up. So the heart rate goes up, the breathing gets rapid and shallow, the anxiety and stress response begin, and panic or anxiety can set in. This is what PTSD is. This is where anxiety and stress disorders come from. The other thing the amygdala does when it triggers, because it's just below, as you see, the thalamus, which is to protect us, because if there is an environmental problem that could threaten us, then we want to react to that immediately. And so it shuts down the frontal lobe of the brain, takes it offline, so we cannot process any more logical input. That's offline for us. Now, that's a great reaction to have if there's a tiger behind us, but it's not so good in the middle of Walmart, huh? It interferes with our ability to think and complete tasks. And so one reason this happens is that in the middle of trauma, that amygdala shuts off the frontal lobe, and so the organs responsible for storing our memories, the hypothalamus and the hippocampus, are not able to do that effectively. And so often when we relive these events, because the hypothalamus and hippocampus carry this memory up to the frontal lobe where it's time-stamped, in a trauma event, that memory does not get stored that way, and so there's no timestamp. So if my PTSD is triggered, I feel like whatever is happening right now, because the memory of that does not say, oh, well, this happened on September 23rd, 2016. That timestamp was not placed on there, so now it's happening, but it's happening again, right here and now. This is why so many vets put up signs in their yards on 4th of July that say, please no fireworks. There's a vet that lives here with PTSD, because when he hears those fireworks, he's not thinking this is 4th of July. All of a sudden, it's the middle of a hot desert and it's happening again. First, though, let's talk about brain development and trauma, and how trauma affects brain development, and we'll get into how that can feed into anxiety a little bit in a minute. When you're born, as a newborn, if you look at that slide on the left there, you have about 100 billion neurons in the brain, but there are not that many connections between those neurons forming pathways. And then you could see as you get to 1 month and 9 months and then on to 2 years, you're at a maximum density. You have far more connections than you actually need at 2 years old. Trillions and trillions of connections between those 100 billion or so neurons. All right, and the rest of your life, from 2 years on pretty much, your brain is pruning those connections and wiring. If you look at that last slide there, the wiring between those neurons is thicker and denser, but there's not as much of the connections. So it prunes out those connections, just like a tree farmer would prune his fruit trees to provide bigger, better fruit. Your brain prunes out a lot of those connections that are not being effectively used so that it makes stronger, denser connections between various neurons. And so that's why we say in the field that the neurons that fire together wire together. And this is also why things that trigger PTSD do so, because if, using the ditch example, if I am smelling water that is moldy, then all of a sudden I've got the neurons for water and the neurons for mold wired together as with the neuron for traumatic event. And so I'm automatically triggered and in that space. I want to talk a little bit here about autism and how that plays out, because the interesting thing is that in autism and in trauma at times, especially if that trauma was early on, the pruning of the brain does not happen real effectively. And this is why a lot of times trauma and autism are confused for one another and they look a lot alike. And it's also why in other presentations I argue that autism is a trauma event. But let's stick with the trauma here and how the pruning process is slowed down and not as effective. In autism, the other thing that happens often is that the amygdala is larger and denser in individuals with autism than neurotypical individuals. So just off the subject of our PTSD, we can see why individuals with autism might respond with meltdown in situations that seem fairly normal to us, but signal, because of an inability to process sensory input, signal danger to them in certain situations. So I want you to think about this and the way your brain is wired, because one of the things we can do with mindfulness is begin to rewire those pathways. We know from mindfulness, just from being able to slow down the body, and we're going to get to that in a minute, that we can begin rewiring the brain and the way that we react to things. So I want to talk about anxiety, stress, and depression and how they're related too. We know that prolonged stress, constantly being in a job that's demanding, constantly being behind on bills, the stress of poverty is a big issue with sociologists now because we know that it affects the brain. That can result in anxiety, and prolonged anxiety, because it affects certain chemicals in the brain, the system becomes used to the high levels of bad chemicals like the cortisol and the adrenaline, and the lack of good chemicals because the serotonins, the oxytocin, things like that are reduced. And so that creates a depressive state in the brain. Those chemicals like serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin are decreased as a result of the anxiety and stress. And over time, it begins to starve the brain and result in depression. So depression can be either brief episodes. Someone in my family died, and it created, months of grief and depression as a result. Or it can be chronic. If I have several big events like that happen, several people close to me die over a period of a year or 2 years or 3 years, that depression can become chronic, or it can become periodic and be very deep depressive states that last for a month or two, then let up for a month or two, then come back and go on for years like that. So depression can look like a lot of these things, and these three things, anxiety, stress, and depression, are really, really related. Mindfulness can help, and we're going to talk about how in a minute. But what is mindfulness? Let's start with that. Mindfulness begins with watching the breath. It's about getting in touch with our body states. So as we begin breathing and we really just focus on the breath and the rising and falling of the lungs and the beating of our heart, we're getting in touch with what's going on in our body, and we start to notice, oh my gosh, I'm feeling a little anxiety. I'm feeling a little stress, tightness in my shoulders or my neck or my stomach, or wherever we feel it. Different people carry it different places. So we're learning about where we carry our stress and anxiety so that when we are in Walmart and something triggers us, we feel that tightening in the shoulders or the tightening in the back muscles, and we realize, ooh, I'm starting to stress out. And that's that early warning sign that keys us into going back to focusing on our breath and learning to ground ourselves. So we kind of learn to become the observer as our emotions as they rise up. We learn to have what I call, what the Buddhists call, a detached attention to our emotional states, to what's going on with us. And regulating the breathing is regulating the thinking. So that if we regulate the breathing and we just pay attention to that, we're also regulating our thinking to some extent. Now, the idea of mindfulness is not to get control of my thoughts and emotions. The idea of mindfulness is to keep my thoughts and emotions from getting control of me. So thoughts and emotions are going to come up. We're human beings. I've been practicing 30 years, and I still have random thoughts pop up when I try and sit in moments of meditation or mindfulness, right? That's okay. That happens. We cannot control our thoughts and emotions. What we don't want to do is play whack-a-mole, try and beat them down. What we don't want to do is chase them in circles. We just want to let them be what they are and observe them from a detached perspective. How does mindfulness differ from meditation? Meditation is more directed often. Mindfulness is really just paying attention to the body. So we're doing what psychologists call the bottom-up processing, which is from the body to the brain. Okay? We're going to talk about that in just a minute here. So the mindfulness and the brain, we're going to talk about how that works. The mind and the body are intimately connected. We know that mindfulness, we said, can increase neural pathways. It can redirect neural pathways, and it can strengthen those connections in neural pathways. It improves the pruning process. It increases executive function. Now, executive function is that ability to go from one thing to the next and shift my attention from one task to the next task smoothly and without a lot of confusion or delay. That's executive function in a nutshell, okay? So multitasking is a myth. We don't actually multitask, we microtask. We go from one task to another, bing, 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 bing. Being able to do that smoothly and without a lot of delay and without losing our mind is executive function. And we can increase that with mindfulness because we're training the brain to focus on whatever I need to focus on in this moment. The other thing that mindfulness does in the brain is it increases oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hug drug. It's the drug that pushes our social relatedness, makes us feel good. It also increases serotonin levels. But oxytocin is that drug that gets secreted when we give hugs of 20 seconds or more, and it just like, that feels good. So when your kids are stressing out and they're angry, you tell them, come over here and get your oxytocin fix, and give them a 20-second hug, and it's going to help them de-stress. The same with cortisol is we talked about, the one that's released by the amygdala. Mindfulness can reduce the amount of cortisol in the body so that we have a lowered stress response going on. Now, what we know is that there's a very distinct mind-body connection. So we talk about bottom-up processing being from the body, me getting control over my breathing and my heart rate, and that changing my brain response, right? Or top-down, where my amygdala triggers and I go from brain to body, where my brain triggers and the limbic region takes over, and all of a sudden my heart rate goes up and my breathing gets rapid and shallow and I start to sweat and all those body reactions begin. So I have a really good example of this in that one time I had to have a heart test, stress test done. And because my knees are bad, I can't do a stress test on a treadmill. So I had to do a chemical stress test. And let me tell you now, if they ever offer you that as an option, don't take it. It's horrible. They injected me with a chemical that was supposed to bring my heart rate up to around 155 beats a minute, which is exceptional. And it created in me an anxiety attack. So that's bottom-up processing, right? I could feel the anxiety and the panic set in because my body, my heart rate is just shooting through the roof, and so my body is screaming to my brain, there must be something wrong here. And so my brain starts to feel all this anxiety that there's really no reason for because I'm laying on a table surrounded by nurses. I'm good, you know? So I start to do exactly what I'm trained myself to do over the years, and that is when I start to feel that anxiety, I start to breathe, and I breathe through that space, and my heart rate goes on the monitor from 145 to 135 beats a minute. And the nurses are like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm breathing." And they said, "You can't do that." And I said, "Well, I kind of have to breathe." And they're like, "No, you can't do that kind of breathing. You just need to let your heart rate go." So I had to let go of that. But that's the top down processing. That's me using my mindfulness to control my breathing and slow it down and release the anxiety. And that also controls the body. So this connection is very real. And that is the hope in being able to control our anxiety and PTSD responses and to increase some of those good chemicals that we know fight depression and release some of those bad chemicals that can create it, like the constant adrenaline and cortisol that get released when we're in an anxious state all the time. Okay, so let's start with a basic exercise and relaxation. And I want to try a little something here when we do this, something I don't generally do in my presentations. But I thought about adding, so we'll try it here. And that is, I want you to think about something that you're concerned about in the future, something that worries you. Get it firmly in your head. Allow the anxiety to rise up a little bit around that issue. We don't want to get too wrapped up in it. I don't want to go too deep here, but I just thought it would be an interesting thing to try. Let's see if this doesn't work for you. Okay. Then I want you to get yourself relaxed and comfortable in the chair. Try and clear your mind a little bit from that thought. And when we do this exercise, we're just going to breathe normally. Okay. And we're going to count our breath. And we're just going to breathe normally. I'm going to go ahead and start the music, and then I'll talk you through it. And then I'm going to leave you to it for about 2 minutes. Okay? So I'm going to start the music here. I want you to get your feet firmly on the floor. Kind of adjust yourself in your chair so that you're comfortable. And when you breathe, I want you to breathe in through your nose. And we're going to count to 3. 1, 2, 3. And then hold and out through the mouth. 3, 2, 1. So we just want to get a nice natural cycle going here, in through the nose, out through the mouth, focusing on the rise and fall of your chest, and counting the breath as it goes in and out. Just allow yourself to relax. Do you feel tension anywhere in your body? If you feel tension anywhere in your body, I want you to think about that. And as you breathe out, I want you to feel that relaxing as if there were a warm light going through that space in your body, relaxing that tension. Then go back to focusing on your breath. As you breathe in, 1, 2, yourself to slowly return to normal here. We're going to wiggle the toes and shake the hands a little bit. Let your feet plant firmly into the ground and return to your body. Open your eyes and begin to notice the environment around you again. Take another deep cleansing breath and let's move on. So how was that for you? I suspect that if you're anything like me, even after 30 years of practice, there were intrusive thoughts while you were trying to just focus on your breath. There were thoughts about the bills tomorrow or the kids or, what am I going to do with my job? What am I going to do with my spouse? What am I going to do with myself? What am I going to do? All the little anxious thoughts the Buddhists call monkey mind. It's like a bunch of little monkeys bouncing off the walls of your skull. The trick here is that we don't attach to them. That we learn to become this distanced observer of them without being involved. We don't play whack-a-mole, try to squash them. Remember, we talked about the idea behind mindfulness is not to control my thoughts and emotions. It's to keep my thoughts and emotions from controlling me. So we don't want to play whack-a-mole. We don't want to try to chase them down, get rid of them, anything like that. We just want to let them be. Just let them go in and out and be here 1 second and gone the next. We can't control our thoughts or emotions. We simply don't have to attach to them. One suggestion I make to clients is that they imagine a ball of light surrounding that anxious thought and then dissolving. And as they see that light dissolve, they're releasing the thoughts, and then they return to the breath and remind themselves that they're breathing and start counting again. And so sometimes we have to do that multiple times while we're sitting. Even after years of practice, I still have times when the monkey mind's a little bit crazy and I have to really sit with myself and be patient and just keep coming back to the breath. So I want to try another exercise here. We're going to move on to that. And in this exercise is a basic grounding exercise. So I want you to get comfortable again. We're not going to use any music here. We're just going to start with those regulated breaths where we count to 3 as we breathe in through the nose and hold, and then count to 3 as we breathe out. And we're going to take 2 of those regulated breaths. And then I want you to look around you in the room you're in and say quietly to yourself 3 things that you can see in that room. And then 2 more regulated breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. Counting to 3. And then I want you to listen to the room around you and tell me 3 things that you can hear. Just say those quietly to yourself. I hear cars. I hear. Okay, and then 2 more regulated breaths in and out. Now, I think if you did this, you found it pretty mind-clearing to be able to do that exercise just real quickly like that, right? And this is a pretty common exercise. A lot of people do it with more than sight and sound. Some people add smell or they add touch. I can feel the wind on my skin, the chair under my butt, the ground under my feet, things like that. The important thing is that we're rooting ourselves in the here and now. The reason we want to do this is because, remember, anxiety is about the past and the fear of what has happened in the past or the fear of what might happen in the future. And so in doing this exercise, we're thinking about what is around me here and now, very concrete things. And we're doing that bottom-up processing. We're noticing what's going on with the body and feeding that information to the brain directly. And we're forcing the limbic region to let go. We're telling it we're safe. There's no reason to react by secreting all these bad chemicals. I'm in the here and now. Everything's fine. So we can follow this exercise with the relaxation exercise we did previously with the music if we really want to, and that's going to deepen. If we have the time and space to do that, that's really going to deepen that relaxation state for us. And clean out the last of that anxiety residue. So now, as you advance in your practice, you're going to find that practice itself is more and more important. Because as we're sitting in these quiet moments, we're going to become very aware as thoughts arise of where we're feeling tension, where we feel that rise up as the anxious thoughts start to enter. Do I feel it first in my shoulders, in my legs? I have clients who tell me their fists start to get tightened or their face muscles start to tighten up. So we're going to become very aware of those body signals that alert us to triggers as they're coming up, right? And eventually that will become second nature. So now with me, sometimes I'll be driving down the road and I'll just check in with my body, and I have this wonderful little app that does that for me that I'll tell you about towards the end here. But I have this, check in with my body time, and I realize, gosh, my shoulders are tense. And I'll start my breathing exercise, just even as I'm driving down the road. Granted, I don't close my eyes then, but I just kind of breathe in, breathe out, and I feel my shoulders begin to relax, because that's where my early signals are in my shoulders. That's where I feel the tension most, right? In the back of my neck and my shoulders. So in, out. That becomes my second nature when I start to feel that tension rise up. It really prevents it from getting a hold of me and going further. Regular practice, just like going to the gym, if you're going to work out and try to build your body up, you want to practice regularly every day. I suggest to a lot of my patients that they practice either right before or right after mealtime. If you find that hunger is going to distract you, then go ahead and eat first so that you can focus on that exercise. But if you find that you're eating for emotional reasons, or you're using food for the wrong reasons, then maybe mindful eating, that's something that I've started to incorporate in my own practice, is that so we start our practice before the meal, and then we pay more attention to what we're eating as we go through. So, but either way, set it around something that already exists in your life as a routine so that you're getting this regular practice in every day. So I want to do one more thing. I want to make a disclaimer here. And I want to say that while mindfulness is an excellent tool and is going to reduce the symptoms when used regularly, often you also need therapy and medication when the symptoms are really bad, okay? Depression is nothing to toy with. It can get really bad really quick. And so get yourself into therapy, talk to a doctor about medications. Mindfulness is I've even seen mindfulness reduce the need for medications in many, many cases. In some cases, I've seen it take away the need for medications entirely from individuals. But I don't want you to think that it's automatically going to do that for you, okay? Research shows that talk therapy and medication are excellent treatment for disorders like depression and anxiety. And while mindfulness can reduce the need for medication, even in severe cases, it often is not enough. What happens is that the depression can get so deep that it turns off some of our serotonin receptors in the brain, and we get really, really depressed. And so we need those SSRIs. Those are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So the brain gets rid of the serotonin, but that drug keeps that from happening. So it keeps that nice little I'm happy drug in the brain a little longer for us because we need that drug. And part of the problem of anxiety is that it secretes other drugs that fight that drug, and it creates a chronically low state of that in the brain. That state can also occur for other reasons, but either way, it results in a depression that is really biologically and clinically driven. So we need to be doing something about that when it gets to that level. Mindfulness is great. It increases levels of serotonin. It increases levels of oxytocin. But at some point, we may need medication to jumpstart that whole system again. And before I leave you, I wanted to give you a list of some helpful apps that I use occasionally. Chill is the one that I really like the most personally, just because for me, what I need is just daily reminders to check in with my body and make sure everything's going well. So I set chill on my phone. It goes off 4 or 5 times a day, and it will just give me a little gong sound. And I look down on my phone, and there's a little suggestion that says, can you feel your feet on the ground? Or can you take 2 deep breaths right now? Or where are you feeling stress in your body? Just questions that really make me check in with what's going on with me, which is a really good thing. In addition, it'll give you these daily meditative suggestions. So your daily suggestion will be something like, think about the good things in your life, or think about, this or that, or what are your major sources of stress. Focus on those today, that kind of thing. Um, then there's the Stop, Breathe, Think app, which I recommend to a lot of my patients who are just starting. It's a good app with a lot of like free exercises initially, so different things like to help you sleep or do this or do that. It's a really good app. Some of them guided, some of them just music that allow you to do your own thing in the mindfulness space. And then there's Headspace, which I have not used extensively myself, but I've heard is a fantastic app. Lots of my therapist friends use it and recommend it. It does cost though. I don't know. I think it's $10 or $15 a month to subscribe to that. So really, if you're looking for the free ones, I highly recommend the other two. But I've heard that Headspace is fantastic too, so that's why I put it in there. There are lots of apps out there. Download a few, give them a try. If you like them, stick with them. If you don't, no big deal. The important thing is that we really keep that daily practice going. Last but not least, I have a podcast called Mindful Recovery. It's available on all these formats, and now it's also on iHeartRadio. And so I want you to be aware that you can get it at any of these places, or you can get it on the website at mindfulrecoverypodcast.com. It is a podcast dedicated to helping individuals recover from trauma and addictions by integrating mindfulness practice into their recovery process. It's more than that, though, because I have experts in the field of trauma and addictions from all over the United States, sometimes the world, and we talk about, we provide psychoeducation and talk about different issues that people might be dealing with. And then some of the episodes are just me leading you through some mindfulness exercises to help you in your recovery, dealing with issues like relationship and self-image and self-compassion and forgiveness and things like that. So do check that out. In addition, my contact information is here, and I am available for coaching. I do not do therapy by internet or Skype. I do not believe in that personally. I believe the one-on-one in the room therapy allows me to attune with you in a much deeper and better way so we can work through those difficult things. If you're in the Kansas City area, I'd love to get connected with you, maybe help you through some of those things. And if my caseload is full, I'm more than willing at no charge to consult with you and to help you find a therapist in the Kansas City area. I do know a lot of really good therapists in the area. But if you want coaching, I do that too, so we can work on the mindfulness techniques and trying to control the anxiety and the depression with mindfulness in that way. Do feel free to reach out and contact me. I'm pretty good about getting back to you. All right. Thanks for coming. I appreciate your time, and I hope you found this helpful. If you have, shoot me some feedback at that email down there at the bottom. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.